Section 1. Hey guys, tonight we are going underground. Not metaphorically, not poetically, but literally, with a shovel in your blistered hands, mud caked under your fingernails, and the kind of smell hovering around you that makes strangers cross the street before you even get close. Tonight we are stepping into the boots, if you were lucky enough to own a pair, of a medieval gravedigger. And before you picture some dramatic, cloaked figure leaning on a spade in the moonlight like a Gothic painting come to life, let me stop you right there. The reality was muddier, lonelier, and considerably more depressing than any painting could capture. You probably won't survive this one. Not because of the swords or the sieges or the political intrigue that fills most history books, but because of the quiet, grinding, back-destroying, socially annihilating horror of doing the job that absolutely everyone needed and absolutely no one wanted to acknowledge. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from tonight and what time it is where you are. I love knowing that someone in New Zealand and someone in Norway are both drifting off to the same story at completely different hours. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing at the edge of a field just beyond the stone wall of a village church somewhere in England or France or perhaps Germany. It barely matters because the scene is nearly identical across most of medieval Western Europe. The year is somewhere in the broad, unhurried stretch between 1000 and 1350, before everything goes catastrophically sideways in ways we will get to later. The ground beneath your feet is cold. Not the pleasant cool of an autumn morning, but the dense, resistant cold of earth that has been compacted by centuries of feet and rain and the slow, patient weight of time. You are holding a mattock, a heavy, iron-headed tool that is part pickaxe, part hoe, and entirely unpleasant. And your job today, as it was yesterday and will be tomorrow, is to open the earth and place someone inside it. This is your life. This is your trade. And the question worth sitting with as you ease into the darkness tonight is how exactly a person ended up here, at this particular edge of this particular field, doing this particular thing for a living. The answer is almost never a clean one. In medieval Europe, most professions were inherited. The son of a blacksmith learned to be a blacksmith. The son of a miller learned the mill. The trades passed from father to son like heirlooms, sometimes cherished, sometimes simply unavoidable. Grave digging was no different in that mechanical sense, but it carried a weight that most other trades did not. It was what historians of medieval labor sometimes call a liminal profession, meaning it existed at the threshold between the world of the living and the world of the dead, and society treated it accordingly. You were necessary. You were essential. You were also, in a very real and socially concrete way, untouchable, and not in the flattering sense. Let's back up a little and think about who actually held this job, because it was rarely a single dedicated person with an official title and a little carved sign outside their cottage reading Gravedigger St. 1247. In the early medieval period, the responsibility for burial was diffuse and community-based. When someone died in a small village, the digging might fall to whoever was available. Young men from the parish, farm laborers between seasons, or the family of the deceased themselves. There was no professional class of grave diggers in the modern sense. Death was common enough and communities small enough that the work was folded into the general texture of rural life. You dug a grave the way you mended a fence or slaughtered a pig, because it needed doing and someone had to do it. But as the medieval period matured, as towns grew larger and churches became more organized, and as the population of Europe swelled toward its pre-plague peak somewhere around the early 14th century, something shifted. The sheer volume of death in a functioning medieval town, not crisis death, just ordinary death from illness and age and accident and the general fragility of human bodies in a world without germ theory or antibiotics, created enough consistent demand that certain individuals began to specialize. And once you specialized in this particular thing, something interesting happened to your social position. You became, in the eyes of your community, associated with death itself, not just adjacent to it, not merely familiar with it. You became, in a very uncomfortable way, its representative on Earth. This is the part that modern people tend to underestimate when they think about medieval attitudes toward death. We live in a culture that is fairly good at hiding its dead, hospitals, funeral homes, crematoriums, All of these modern institutions exist partly to put comfortable professional distance between ordinary life and the physical reality of dying. Medieval people did not have that luxury. Death happened at home, in the street, in the fields. Bodies were prepared by family members, laid out on tables, washed by neighbors. Death was intimate in a way that we have largely engineered out of our experience. And yet, even in that world of constant proximity to death, the person who actually dug the hole, who made physical contact with the cold, packed earth, who lowered the shrouded body, who shoveled the dirt back in, that person occupied a category apart. Historians still argue whether this marginalization was primarily religious, economic, or simply the result of practical concerns like disease avoidance, but whatever its origins, the social reality was consistent. The gravedigger was kept at arm's length by the very community he served. In ecclesiastical records, the church documents that are among our best surviving sources for medieval life, gravediggers appear occasionally under various Latin terms. Facerius is the most common, derived directly from the Latin for one who digs. You might also encounter fosser, which carries the same root and the same meaning. These terms appear in parish accounts, in records of payment, in the occasional legal document. They tell us that the job was recognized, that it was compensated, usually modestly, usually in kind, sometimes in small coin, and that it was formal enough to leave a paper trail. But they do not tell us very much about the people behind the title, because medieval record-keeping was not especially interested in the inner lives of laborers at the bottom of the social order. What we can piece together from those records, supplemented by the occasional literary reference and the rich material evidence of archaeological excavations of medieval cemeteries, is something like this: the gravedigger was typically male, typically adult, typically poor, and typically someone with few other viable options. That last point matters more than it might initially seem. The job paid, consistently if not generously, and in a world where consistent income was genuinely hard to come by for people without land or trade skills, that consistency was not nothing. You could eat. You could, if you were careful, save a little. You existed within the economic life of your community, even if you existed at its edges. Some gravediggers were employed directly by the church and received a small but regular wage from the parish. Others were essentially freelance, called upon when needed and paid per grave. In larger towns with substantial cemeteries, the role might be semi-permanent, attached to a specific churchyard in an unofficial but understood way. In smaller villages, the same man might dig graves, ring the church bell for funerals, and do odd jobs around the churchyard, a kind of all-purpose death administrator, which sounds almost impressive until you remember what the day-to-day actually looked like. Because here is what a day in your life actually looks like, in this cold field, in this not quite definable year between 1000 and 1350. You have been told, sometimes by a priest, sometimes by a grieving family, sometimes by a neighbor dispatched with the news, that someone has died and needs burying. You have been given a location in the churchyard, a rough sense of when the funeral will occur, and in the better organized parishes, some indication of what kind of grave is expected. What kind matters here more than you might expect, because medieval graves were not standardized in the way modern cemetery plots are. The depth varied. The placement in the churchyard varied enormously, because location within a Christian cemetery was freighted with theological and social meaning that we will explore more fully in a later section. For now, just know that the spot you are assigned to dig is not random, and that the expectations placed on you, the depth, the dimensions, the neatness of the edges, are real, even if never written down anywhere you could read. You begin digging, and this, right here, is where the romantic image of the solitary gravedigger, all brooding philosophy and theatrical skull contemplation, dissolves completely into the physical reality of the work. Medieval soil was not uniform, and it was almost never cooperative. In a well-established churchyard that had been in use for generations, you were digging into ground that had already been dug before, potentially many times. You were encountering the remains of previous occupants, bones, fragments of shroud, occasionally the remnants of a wooden coffin, though coffins were not nearly as universal in this period as we tend to assume. Most ordinary medieval burials were simply the body wrapped in a shroud, placed directly in the earth. No box, no cushioning, just the linen and the dirt, which means that when you dug into old churchyard ground, you were moving through a dense, layered archaeology of previous bodies, and you needed to do so without, officially at least, causing undue disturbance or disrespect. There was a quirky practical solution to this problem that some parishes developed, particularly in areas where churchyard space was genuinely limited: the charnel house. This was a building, sometimes a small chapel, sometimes just a dedicated room, where the bones displaced during new grave digging were collected and stored. If you have ever seen images of the famous ossuaries of Europe, those underground chambers lined with thousands of neatly arranged skulls and femurs, you are looking at the mature, architecturally ambitious version of what began as a pretty pragmatic response to the problem of running out of room. As a grave digger, the charnel house was part of your professional landscape. You displaced bones, you collected them, you moved them. This was simply part of the job. And through all of this, you were working largely alone, or at best with a single helper, using tools that had changed remarkably little since the Roman period. The mattock, the shovel, a simpler, flatter-headed tool for moving loose earth, and sometimes a wooden bucket on a rope for clearing excavated soil from depth. No machinery, no assistance, just your body and your tools and the resistant, cold, heavy earth day after day. By the time you climbed out of that finished grave, typically somewhere between 4 and 6 feet deep, though this varied significantly by region and period, you would have moved somewhere between half a ton and a full ton of earth, with your hands and a couple of iron tools, before the funeral arrived. And then you stood to the side while the priest said the words, while the family wept, while the community performed its ritual of mourning. And when it was all over and everyone else went home to their fires and their dinners and their living, you stayed behind to fill it in. That is how you got the job. That is what the job was. And that, in its quiet and unglamorous entirety, is why it already, before we have even gotten to the plague or the body snatchers or the things people claim to see in churchyards after midnight, absolutely sucked to be a medieval grave digger. Word count: 3,104. Awaiting, continue. Section 2. The mattock in your hands is heavier than it looks. That is the first thing anyone who has never used one needs to understand. Not the romantic, abstracted weight of labor as a concept, but the specific, immediate, muscle-burning weight of an iron-headed tool that you have been swinging for the better part of 3 hours in the gray, damp cold of a medieval morning. Your shoulders ache in a way that is no longer sharp and specific, but has become a kind of general, blurred suffering that lives somewhere between your neck and your lower back and refuses to identify itself more precisely than that. Your palms, if you are relatively new to this work, are a landscape of developing blisters. If you are experienced, they are simply leather, thick, cracked, occasionally bleeding in the cold, so callous that you have largely stopped registering the sensation. Welcome to Section 2, where we are going to spend some time with the tools of your trade, the physical mechanics of what you actually did all day, and the quite remarkable amount of damage that digging medieval graves did to the human body over the course of a working life. Because one of the things that history tends to skip over, in its enthusiasm for kings and battles and sweeping political narratives, is the sheer physical texture of ordinary labor, and grave digging, even before you factor in any of the more obviously horrifying aspects of the job, was among the most physically brutal forms of work available in the medieval world. Let us start with the mattock, since that is what is already in your hands. The mattock is an ancient tool, genuinely ancient, predating the medieval period by thousands of years and appearing in agricultural contexts across virtually every early civilization that left records. By the medieval period, it had settled into a fairly standard form: a long wooden handle, typically ash or oak, fitted with an iron head that had 2 working surfaces. On one side, a broad, flat blade positioned horizontally, useful for chopping into compacted earth, breaking up roots, and loosening the top layers of soil. On the other, a narrower pick-like projection, angled for penetrating harder ground, breaking up stones, and working into the clay layers that sat beneath the topsoil in much of northern and western Europe. It was a versatile tool, which is part of why it persisted for so long, and it was your primary instrument of excavation for the first part of any dig. The process of opening a grave had a rhythm to it that experienced diggers learned through repetition rather than instruction, because there was no written manual for this work, no apprenticeship program in any formal sense. You learned by doing, or by watching someone else do it, or by making expensive mistakes and correcting them. The first step was marking the outline of the grave, typically using a length of cord stretched between 2 stakes to ensure straight edges, because a neat, straight-sided grave was considered a mark of professional competence. And a grave with uneven or crumbling walls was the kind of thing that reflected badly on you in a community small enough that everyone knew whose work was whose. Dimensions varied, but a standard adult grave in this period ran roughly 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, and somewhere between 4 and 6 feet deep, with the deeper end of that range being more common in areas with significant groundwater or where the soil type made shallower burial unstable. Then you began. Mattock first, working across the surface in systematic strokes to break the top layer. Depending on the season and the recent weather, this could be almost manageable, loose, cooperative soil on a mild autumn day, or it could be an immediate confrontation with frozen ground in winter, baked clay in a dry summer, or the particular misery of waterlogged soil in spring, which had the consistency of cold porridge and the structural integrity of nothing at all. Medieval winters in northern Europe were, for much of this period, genuinely severe. The Little Ice Age, a prolonged cooling episode that climatologists have documented through ice cores, tree rings, and historical records, began intensifying around the late 13th and early 14th centuries, and even before its worst phases. Winter digging in England or northern France or the German territories was a cold, brutal, dangerous proposition. Frozen ground did not simply resist your mattock. It laughed at it. Experienced grave diggers in regions with hard winters developed various strategies for dealing with frost-locked earth. Building small fires over the intended gravesite the night before to thaw the surface, pouring hot water into preliminary cuts. Working in short, aggressive bursts to generate enough heat from exertion to keep the fingers functional. None of these strategies were particularly effective, and all of them added time and effort to a job that was already consuming enough of both. Once the mattock had broken the surface and loosened the upper layers, you switched to the shovel, a simpler tool, essentially a flat iron blade on a wooden handle, used to scoop and move the loosened earth out of the developing hole. In the earlier medieval period, shovels were sometimes made entirely of wood, with only an iron cap on the blade edge for durability, which gives you some sense of how limited and precious iron was as a resource in certain times and places. A full iron shovel was a meaningful possession, worth noting in an inventory, worth passing down. You threw the loosened earth in a heap beside the grave, close enough to be convenient when filling in, far enough not to risk a collapse of the walls, and then alternated between mattock and shovel as you descended. And here is where the physics of the thing become genuinely unkind to your body. In the top 2 feet of a grave, you could swing the mattock freely and throw the shovel loads of earth up and out with reasonable efficiency. By 3 feet down, you were working in a space barely wider than your own shoulders, and throwing earth upward required significantly more force and increasingly awkward angles. By 4 feet, you were effectively in a pit, and moving excavated soil out of the hole required either a long-handled shovel that you could barely control in the confined space, or a bucket system, a wooden or leather bucket on a rope, if you had a helper to haul it, or a laborious process of piling soil on your shovel and lifting it in stages if you were alone. Most of the time, you were alone. The physical consequences of this work, sustained over years and decades, are not simply a matter of historical inference. They are written directly into the skeletal record. Osteoarchaeologists who study human remains from archaeological excavations have identified what they sometimes call occupational stress markers in medieval skeletons. Patterns of bone wear, joint degeneration, and muscle attachment changes that reflect repetitive heavy labor over long periods. Skeletons consistent with sustained digging work show characteristic changes at the shoulder joints, at the lumbar vertebrae, and in the bones of the hands and wrists. The act of repeatedly swinging a heavy tool, of lifting and twisting under load, of working in confined spaces with compromised posture, leaves traces in bone that persist for centuries. You carry your labor in your skeleton, and it stays there long after everything else about you has dissolved back into the earth you spent your life moving. There is a somewhat grim irony in the fact that the people best equipped to tell us about the physical experience of medieval grave digging are the osteologists who study remains from medieval cemeteries, meaning that the evidence of the grave digger's working life is preserved in the very places he spent that life opening and closing. Historians still argue whether the skeletal patterns we associate with heavy digging labor can be reliably attributed to specific occupations versus other forms of agricultural and manual work that involved similar repetitive motions, but the bone changes themselves are not in dispute. This was work that destroyed bodies gradually and comprehensively over the course of a career. Your hands deserve a separate paragraph because they were the part of you that was most constantly in contact with everything the job involved. Medieval work gloves existed, thick leather affairs useful for some tasks, but they were not ideal for grave digging, where tactile feedback from the tool mattered and where gloves reduced grip rather than improving it. Most of the time, you dug barehanded, or with strips of cloth wrapped around the palm in rough improvisation. Your hands were in constant contact with the soil, not just topsoil, but the deeper layers, the clay, the gravel, the occasional seep of groundwater, and in an established churchyard, the material remnants of previous burials. We will talk more about what exactly was in that soil from a microbial perspective when we reach the section on disease, but for now, consider simply the mechanical reality: hands that cracked in cold weather, that bled from blisters and then from the calluses that replaced the blisters, that were permanently stained a particular shade of gray-brown that no amount of washing entirely shifted. The tools themselves required maintenance, which added another layer of labor to a job that was already consuming. Iron rusted, wooden handles cracked and split, especially with the wet-dry cycling that came from constant use in damp soil followed by storage in a cold shed or outbuilding. A broken handle mid-dig was not a minor inconvenience. It was a genuine crisis if you had a funeral waiting and no spare. The grave digger who owned and maintained good tools was better at his job and better able to command a reasonable payment for it. The one who worked with worn, poorly maintained equipment dug slower, worked harder, and produced visibly inferior results. This sounds like simple professional logic, and it is, but it is worth stating because it underlines the extent to which the job had genuine craft elements that get entirely lost when we think of it only in terms of its social status and its connection to death. There were also tools beyond the basic mattock and shovel that appeared in specific contexts and regions. The pick, a narrower, more purely penetrating tool than the mattock, was useful in particularly stony ground. Various forms of raking tools helped clear the bottom of a finished grave to produce the relatively flat surface expected for the body's placement. In waterlogged areas, where the water table was high enough that graves quickly filled with seeping groundwater, some diggers used rudimentary wooden frames to shore up the grave walls, essentially a very primitive form of the shoring systems used in modern trench work, though this was labor-intensive enough that it only happened when the alternative was watching your finished grave collapse before the funeral arrived, which was, frankly, the kind of professional catastrophe that followed you for years in a small community. And here is one of those quirky historical tidbits that tends to get left out of the more formal accounts. In some regions of medieval Europe, particularly in parts of France and the Low Countries, there is evidence from parish records and occasional wills and inventories that grave-digging tools were treated as significant personal property, named in inheritance documents, and sometimes specifically bequeathed. A good mattock or a well-balanced shovel, carefully maintained, might last a working lifetime and represent one of the more valuable objects a grave digger owned. The idea of a man leaving his mattock to his son, specifically as a bequest, not just the tool but the trade, the connection to a particular churchyard, the understood right to dig there, is one of those small historical details that somehow makes the whole thing feel more real and more melancholy than any amount of general description. The other tool in your working life that deserves mention is one you did not physically wield but were absolutely dependent on: the bell. The church bell was the primary communication technology of the medieval community, and its various patterns of ringing conveyed specific information that everyone in the parish understood. The funeral knell, the slow, regular tolling that announced a death and called the community to burial, was the sound that told you your services were needed. In many parishes, the same person who dug the graves also rang the bell, which meant that your working day often began with the physical effort of bell ringing before you even picked up a shovel. Medieval church bells were not small decorative objects. They were massive, heavy instruments, and ringing them properly required significant physical effort. Add this to the digging, and you begin to get a picture of a working day that was exhausting from its first moment to its last. The payment you received for all of this, the bell ringing, the digging, the filling in, the maintenance of the churchyard itself in some arrangements, was modest by any standard. Parish records that survive from the later medieval period give us occasional glimpses of what grave diggers were paid. Small sums in coin, sometimes supplemented by food or drink provided by the bereaved family, occasionally a portion of the funeral offerings that came to the church. In some arrangements, the digger received a share of the candles or the funeral cloth, items with resale value that could be converted to food or other necessities. The variations were significant, and there was no standard rate across even a single region, let alone across all of medieval Europe. You negotiated, or more precisely, you accepted what was offered, because your leverage in that negotiation was limited by the fact that your services were needed but your social position made assertive bargaining socially dangerous. There is something almost quietly devastating about the arithmetic of it. You have moved a ton of earth. You have done it with iron tools in cold ground, largely alone, in conditions that were destroying your joints at a rate that would leave you bent and limited by middle age, and middle age in this context meant somewhere in your 40s if you were lucky. You have done something that your community genuinely could not function without, that had theological significance, that required real skill and physical endurance. And for this you received perhaps a penny or a loaf of bread, or a candle that you could sell for a penny, and the quiet, consistent social message that you were not quite the sort of person one invited to dinner. That was the deal. That was the trade. And you picked up your mattock and you went home, and you got up the next day and you did it again. Word count, 3048. Awaiting, continue. Section 3. The soil you are working in is not simply dirt. This is something you have never been told in any explicit way, because the conceptual framework for understanding what soil actually contains, the microbial ecosystems, the bacterial colonies, the viral particles, the fungal networks, the chemical compounds produced by decomposition, will not exist for another 500 years at minimum. You do not know about germ theory. You do not know about pathogens. You do not know that the ground beneath your hands, in this established churchyard that has been receiving the dead for generations, is one of the more microbiologically complex environments you could possibly be working in with your bare, cracked, bleeding hands pressed directly into it for hours every single day. What you do know, in the way that people who work closely with something develop an intuitive, embodied understanding of it long before anyone finds the words to explain it, is that this soil feels different from field soil. That it has a quality to it, a heaviness, a particular smell, a texture that is not quite like anything else, that marks it as something other than ordinary earth. And in the same wordless way that people who work in it sometimes get sick, sometimes get very sick, sometimes do not recover. But before we get into the specific biological horrors lurking in medieval churchyard soil, let us spend a moment with the official explanation, the one your world actually operated on, because it shaped everything about how you understood your own risk and, more importantly, how you failed to protect yourself from it. The dominant medical theory of the medieval period, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman medicine and transmitted through Islamic scholarship into the European universities that were just beginning to emerge in this era, held that disease was caused by miasma. The word comes from the Greek for pollution or contamination, and the theory held that bad air corrupted by the presence of rotting organic matter, stagnant water, certain kinds of soil disturbance, and the general emanations of decay, was the primary vector of illness. You got sick by breathing bad air. The solution was to avoid bad air, to burn aromatic herbs and resins that were believed to purify the atmosphere, to position yourself upwind of anything rotting, and to generally maintain as much distance as possible between your nose and anything that smelled like death. You will immediately see the problem with this approach for a medieval gravedigger. Your entire professional life was conducted in conditions that miasma theory identified as maximally dangerous. You were digging into soil rich with decomposing organic material. You were disturbing the remains of previous burials, releasing whatever gases and particles were bound up in them. You were working in enclosed spaces, the grave itself, during deeper digging, where any miasmatic air would be concentrated rather than dispersed. And you were doing all of this for hours at a time, day after day, with your face often close to the earth and your lungs working hard from the exertion of the labor. By the standards of your own medical understanding, you were doing almost everything wrong. And by the standards of our medical understanding, you were also doing almost everything wrong, just for somewhat different and considerably more specific reasons. Because the soil in a medieval churchyard was genuinely, measurably hazardous in ways that go well beyond atmospheric discomfort. Let us walk through some of them. The most immediate biological concern in disturbed burial soil is the presence of Clostridium bacteria, a genus of anaerobic organisms that thrive in exactly the low-oxygen, organic-rich environment that deep grave soil provides. Several Clostridium species are capable of causing serious illness in humans, including tetanus, caused by Clostridium tetani, which produces one of the most potent toxins known to biology. Tetanus enters the body through breaks in the skin, cuts, punctures, open blisters, and causes progressive muscular rigidity and spasm that, without modern treatment, is frequently fatal. Your hands, remember, were rarely unbroken. The combination of blistering, cracking, and the occasional cut from a sharp stone or tool fragment meant that your skin barrier was compromised on a near-constant basis, and that compromised skin was in direct, extended contact with soil that was precisely the kind of environment where tetanus spores persist for decades. Tetanus spores, notably, are extraordinarily durable. They can survive in soil for years, even in conditions that would destroy most other pathogens. The churchyard soil you were working in may have contained spores deposited generations before you were born, still viable, still waiting for an opportunity. Anthrax is another soil-borne concern worth raising, caused by Bacillus anthracis, which also forms highly durable spores capable of persisting in soil for extraordinary periods. Medieval cattle and sheep died of anthrax regularly. The disease was endemic in European livestock populations, and animals that died of it were sometimes buried in the same ground or adjacent to human burial grounds, particularly in rural parishes where the church was the center of community life for both humans and their animals. Cutaneous anthrax, the form most associated with skin contact, causes distinctive ulcerating sores but is survivable in a reasonable percentage of cases. Pulmonary anthrax, contracted by inhaling spores disturbed from the soil, which is exactly what you were doing when you dug, is a different matter entirely. Then there is the general category of fungal infections, some of which have soil as their primary reservoir and enter the body through the respiratory system when spores are disturbed during digging. Histoplasmosis, caused by Histoplasma capsulatum, is associated particularly with soil enriched by bird and bat droppings, and medieval churches were reliably home to both. The churchyard environment, with its combination of organic-rich burial soil and the constant presence of roosting birds in the church structure above, created conditions that modern epidemiologists would recognize as a meaningful histoplasmosis risk. The disease ranges from mild flu-like illness to severe pulmonary infection depending on the level of exposure and the immune status of the person affected, and chronic low-level exposure, exactly the kind of exposure a regular grave digger would experience, can produce persistent respiratory symptoms that would have been entirely uninterpretable within the miasma framework. Historians still argue whether the elevated mortality rates sometimes observed in records of medieval gravediggers and church sextons reflect primarily infectious disease risk from the work environment, or whether other factors, poverty, poor nutrition, the social marginalization that limited access to whatever medical care existed, were the dominant contributors. The honest answer is almost certainly that all of these factors were operating simultaneously and were probably not meaningfully separable from each other. A malnourished man with a compromised immune system, doing heavy physical labor in a pathogen-rich environment, while socially positioned in a way that made it difficult to rest when ill or seek help when he needed it. All of these things made each other worse. The job did not kill you in a single dramatic way. It wore you down in a dozen quiet ones. Beyond the microbial hazards of ordinary burial soil, there was a specific and dramatically elevated risk that came from one particular category of interment, the plague pit. We will spend considerably more time on the Black Death in a later section, but even in the pre-plague period, epidemic disease was a recurring feature of medieval life. Dysentery, typhus, smallpox, various forms of fever with poorly documented etiologies, outbreaks happened regularly, and when they did, they produced burials that were different in character from ordinary single interments. Mass burial, even outside the specific context of bubonic plague, was part of your working experience as a medieval grave digger in a town of any size. And the bodies going into those mass graves were bodies that had died of infectious disease, which means they were potentially still infectious, and the soil around them was contaminated in ways that the miasma theory could gesture at but could not actually help you navigate. The smell was the thing that your contemporaries wrote about most consistently when they described grave-digging work, and it is worth taking a moment with it because smell was not merely an aesthetic unpleasantness in this context. It was a data point, a warning signal that your body was registering even if your conscious mind could not interpret it correctly. The smell of a disturbed burial, particularly of remains that were not fully skeletonized, is produced by a complex suite of chemical compounds released during decomposition: cadaverine, putrescine, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, methane, among others. These compounds are detectable by the human nose at extremely low concentrations, which is why the smell is so immediately powerful and so difficult to describe without recourse to the language of extremity. It is not simply unpleasant. It is a smell that produces a physical response: nausea, sometimes a gag reflex, sometimes a cold sweat. That is your body doing exactly what it evolved to do, which is tell you to move away from this source of potential contamination. You could not move away. That was the job. So you developed strategies. Every account we have of people who worked in close proximity to the dead in this period: grave diggers, those who prepared bodies for burial, monks who maintained charnel houses, mentions some version of protective ritual against the smell and its perceived dangers. Herbs held under the nose or stuffed into a cloth worn over the lower face. Rue was particularly favored, along with rosemary and lavender, all plants whose aromatic compounds are genuinely antimicrobial in some contexts, which is one of those happy historical coincidences where folk practice accidentally tracked real biology. Strong drink, consumed before or during the work, was another common strategy, partly for the numbing effect on the nose and the social anxiety that came with the work, and partly because the antiseptic properties of alcohol were dimly understood even without the theoretical framework to explain them. Smoking, in the later medieval period after tobacco had not yet arrived, but when the burning of certain plant materials was practiced, was believed to purify the surrounding air. None of these strategies were adequate to the actual risk, but some of them were not entirely useless either, which is probably why they persisted. There was also the psychological dimension of chronic exposure to smell and sight of death, which is a category of harm that the medieval world had even less conceptual vocabulary for than it did for infectious disease. What we would now recognize as occupational trauma, the cumulative psychological weight of repeated exposure to death and human remains, was not a recognized condition in the medieval period. There was no framework for understanding why a man who had spent 20 years digging graves might become withdrawn, might drink more than was strictly social, might develop sleep disturbances or a flatness of affect that his community noticed and attributed to any number of causes before they landed on the obvious one. The closest the medieval world came to acknowledging this category of harm was in the various folk beliefs and ecclesiastical concerns about the spiritual danger of excessive contact with the dead, concerns that were theologically framed but that were responding to something real about the psychological cost of the work. Here is a quirky and genuinely strange footnote to the history of medical thought about gravediggers' health. In the 16th century, not far outside our main period but close enough to reflect attitudes that had been developing throughout the medieval era, a physician named Girolamo Fracastoro proposed a theory of disease transmission that was meaningfully ahead of its time, suggesting that disease could be spread by tiny particles he called seminaria, or seeds of disease, through direct contact, through contaminated objects, and even at a distance. His framework was still not germ theory in the modern sense, but it was a significant step toward it. And one of the occupational categories he specifically mentioned as being at elevated risk due to their work environment was gravediggers. Even by the emerging proto-scientific standards of the early modern period, the recognition that grave digging was specifically and unusually hazardous to health was becoming explicit. For the medieval grave digger, of course, this recognition came approximately 500 years too late to be of any practical use. What you had, instead of accurate medical knowledge, was a body of folk understanding that was partly wrong, partly accidentally right, and entirely insufficient to the scale of the risk you were living with. You knew the work was dangerous in some general, unspecified way. You knew that men who did it sometimes got sick in ways that men who did other things did not. You knew that the smell was bad and that the bad smell was somehow connected to the danger. And you knew that none of this was a reason to stop, because the alternative to the danger of the work was the danger of not eating, and that calculation was not a complicated one to make. So you held a bit of rosemary under your nose, you took a drink if there was drink to be had, and you went back into the hole. Word count: 3,119. Awaiting, continue. Section 4. The church owns you. Not in the legal sense, serfdom, while a real and grinding reality for many people in medieval Europe, was a separate institution with its own complicated geography and timeline. But in the practical, daily, inescapable sense of your working life, The church owns the ground you dig, the body you are burying, the ritual that frames the entire event, and the small coin that eventually makes its way into your hand at the end of it. You exist, professionally, entirely within an institution that is simultaneously the most powerful organizational force in medieval European society and the entity most deeply ambivalent about what you specifically do for a living. Welcome to the medieval church's relationship with its grave diggers, which was, and there is really no more precise word for it, complicated. Let us start with geography, because the physical layout of medieval burial is itself a map of ecclesiastical power and social hierarchy that you navigated every single working day. The churchyard, the consecrated ground surrounding the church building, was not a neutral space. It was theologically charged territory, carefully delineated from the unconsecrated world around it by a boundary that was simultaneously physical, legal, and spiritual. The wall or fence that surrounded most medieval churchyards was not primarily a practical structure designed to keep animals out, though it served that purpose too. It was a boundary marker between sacred and profane space, between the community of Christian dead who rested within its protection and everything outside that did not qualify for that protection. And qualification was everything. The medieval church had an elaborate and rigorously maintained taxonomy of who deserved to be buried in consecrated ground, who was merely permitted to be buried there, and who was explicitly excluded. The fully initiated, baptized Christian who had died in a state of grace and received last rites, the viaticum, the final anointing, the prayers for the departing soul, occupied the top of this hierarchy. They received burial in consecrated ground, with the full liturgical apparatus of the funeral mass, and their position within the churchyard was understood to matter for their soul's journey. Burial oriented east-west, with the head to the west so that the body faced east, toward Jerusalem, toward the rising sun, toward the direction from which Christ was expected to return at the Last Judgment, was the standard Christian orientation, and your job was to ensure the grave was correctly aligned. This was not a preference. This was theology made physical, and getting it wrong was not a minor error. Within the churchyard itself, position mattered enormously. Burial closest to the church building, particularly to the east end near the altar, was the most desirable, and therefore the most expensive, and therefore the exclusive province of the wealthy, the powerful, and the ecclesiastically well-connected. Burial inside the church itself, beneath the floor or in wall niches, was for the very highest tier of local society: nobles, wealthy merchants, important clergy, and the fees associated with such interments were substantial. As you moved outward from the church building, social status declined in a fairly direct spatial relationship, with the humblest burials occurring at the periphery of the churchyard, near the walls, in the areas that received less pastoral attention and less prestige. The north side of the churchyard, in a tradition whose origins historians still debate with some vigor, was generally considered the least desirable, less sunlit, less prominent, associated in folk belief with shadow and coldness and the devil's territory, and was frequently the area where suicides, executed criminals, and others whose claim to full Christian burial was ambiguous or contested were interred, if they were permitted in the churchyard at all. Those who were not permitted in the churchyard formed a significant population, and managing the boundary between those who qualified and those who did not was one of the more fraught aspects of your working relationship with the church and with the grieving families you served. Excommunicates, people formally expelled from the church community, were denied Christian burial. So were unbaptized infants, which is one of the more heartbreaking aspects of medieval religious practice and one that generated its own geography of informal burial sites. Liminal spaces at the edges of settlements, at crossroads, in unconsecrated ground near but not within the churchyard, where the tiny bodies of children who had died before baptism could be laid without the full weight of theological exclusion but also without the comfort of official blessing. Suicides were excluded, at least in principle and in official doctrine, though in practice the local priest had considerable discretion to find mitigating circumstances that permitted burial in consecrated ground, particularly when the deceased was someone of social standing whose family had the means to make the relevant case persuasively. The poor man who took his own life was far more likely to find himself on the wrong side of the churchyard wall than the wealthy man who did the same thing, which tells you something useful about the relationship between theology and practical social power in the medieval world. As the grave digger, you were the person who physically enacted these distinctions. You dug in the places the priest designated. You were not, in most cases, the decision-maker about who went where. But you were present at every stage of the process, which meant that you accumulated a particular kind of knowledge about your community, who had died in disgrace, who had been quietly accommodated despite the official rules, who had paid for a better position than their social standing strictly warranted, whose family had argued with the priest about the location and lost. You were, in a sense, the keeper of the community's burial secrets, and burial secrets in a world where eternal salvation was understood to be geographically indexed were not trivial things to know. Your relationship with the parish priest who oversaw your churchyard was the central professional relationship of your working life, and it was rarely a relationship between equals. The priest controlled access to the consecrated ground, determined the schedule and the specifics of each burial, and was your de facto employer in any parish arrangement where your work was formally tied to the church. He was also, typically, significantly better educated than you, significantly higher in the social order, and significantly more protected by institutional structures if any dispute between you became contentious. The power differential was clear and was understood by both parties. This did not mean the relationship was always hostile. Many parish records from the later medieval period, the 13th and 14th centuries, when church administration had become considerably more systematized and record-keeping more thorough, give glimpses of what appear to have been functional, even cordial working relationships between priests and their associated grave diggers or sextons. The sexton, which is the term that begins appearing more consistently in English records from roughly the 12th century onward, was a church official of the lowest order, responsible for the physical maintenance of the church building and its grounds as well as the digging of graves. The term itself derives from the Latin sacristanus, meaning keeper of sacred things, which is a genuinely elevated-sounding title for a job that involved a lot of mud and bone displacement. Some sextons were minor clerics, men in the lower orders of the church hierarchy who had received some education and a modicum of formal religious status. Others were simply laymen who had been appointed to the role by local clergy or community arrangement. The distinction mattered for things like whether you could read the burial records you might be asked to maintain, whether you had any formal protection from the church's legal structures, and how you were addressed and treated in the daily life of the parish. The church's ambivalence about your work expressed itself in several specific and practically significant ways. On one hand, burial of the dead was a corporal work of mercy, one of the 7 charitable acts that Catholic teaching identified as expressions of Christian love, derived from the Gospel of Matthew and the tradition of Tobit in the Hebrew Scriptures. Burying the dead was spiritually meritorious. It was good. The church endorsed it, celebrated it, built entire liturgical structures around it. On the other hand, the person who actually did the physical work of burial was in constant contact with the dead, which generated ritual impurity concerns that ran deep in the religious culture of the period. The tension between the spiritual value of the act and the ritual danger of the person performing it was never fully resolved in medieval theology, and it played out in the practical texture of your daily working life in ways both subtle and direct. One of the most concrete expressions of this ambivalence concerned your access to the sacramental life of the church. Were you expected to receive communion? To attend Mass? Of course, you were a Christian, and these were Christian obligations. But attending Mass while in a state of ritual impurity generated by your work was theologically uncomfortable, and different localities and different periods handled this discomfort differently. Some parish arrangements specified that the grave digger should wash and change clothes before entering the church for services, a reasonable enough practical requirement that also functioned as a symbolic purification boundary. Others were less formal about it. Some grave diggers appear, from the indirect evidence of their exclusion from certain parish social functions, to have been de facto marginalized from the full community life of the church even while being technically included in its official structures. The fees and payments associated with burial were another area of ongoing tension. The medieval church ran on fees for masses, for candles, for prayers, for the specific liturgical services associated with funerals, and these fees were a significant source of income for parish clergy. The grave digger's portion of this economic system was typically modest and often contested. Who had the right to charge for burial? Who received the payment for specific elements of the funeral? In parishes where the grave digger was a formally appointed sexton, his income was at least partially regularized through the church's accounting. In more informal arrangements, the question of payment was subject to negotiation with each family, and families in grief were not always in the most generous or rational frame of mind. There is a wonderfully specific historical detail from English ecclesiastical records of the 13th century, a series of synodal statutes, formal rulings by regional church councils, that attempted to regulate the fees charged for burial and to prevent what the records delicately describe as extortion of the bereaved by church officials. The fact that these regulations were thought necessary tells you something important about the reality they were trying to address. People responsible for burial were, in at least some cases, leveraging the vulnerability of grieving families to extract higher payments than were customary or fair. Whether the gravedigger was typically the agent of this extortion or more often its victim, squeezed between the family's limited resources and the priest's prior claim on the funeral fees, is a question the records do not always answer clearly. Historians still argue whether these regulations reflect widespread abuse or isolated cases that generated disproportionate documentary attention. But the regulations exist, which means the behavior they addressed existed, and the gravedigger occupied enough of a middle position in the economic transaction of burial that his role in it was worth regulating. The question of who received a good burial, and what a good burial actually meant in practical physical terms, was one that the Church theoretically answered through its theology, but that was practically determined through a combination of social status, family resources, personal relationships with the parish clergy, and the specific circumstances of death. A wealthy parishioner could expect burial inside the church, or in a prominent churchyard position, with numerous masses said for their soul, candles, a proper wooden coffin, a stone marker. A poor parishioner received a shroud burial in the general area of the churchyard, a brief funeral mass if the family could manage the fee, and a wooden grave marker if anyone thought to provide one. Markers that rotted within a generation and left no permanent trace. An extremely poor parishioner, a stranger, a marginal person, might receive what the records sometimes call burial ad succurrendum, burial in emergency, stripped of most ceremonial elements, at minimal cost and with minimal attention. You dug all of these graves. The rich man's grave inside the church, cutting through the stone floor with tools that were not really designed for the purpose and hoping you did not damage anything significant in the process. The middle-class parishioner's decent churchyard plot, with its careful orientation and reasonably neat edges. The poor man's hurried hole at the north edge of the yard, dug fast because there were other things to do and nobody was paying much attention. Each of these was your work, and each carried its own specific set of expectations, pressures, and complications. What you had navigating all of this was a position of genuine structural vulnerability. The church needed you. The community needed you. The theology endorsed what you did. And none of that translated into social respect, legal protection, or economic security in any consistent or reliable way. You were useful and marginal simultaneously, which is a combination that the medieval social order was very good at producing and very bad at resolving. Quirky as it sounds, some gravediggers found a kind of leverage in their intimate knowledge of the churchyard's physical history, knowing where specific bodies were buried, knowing which graves had been disturbed and which had not, knowing the physical secrets of the sacred ground that no one else had reason to know. This knowledge was not formally valuable, could not be traded or sold in any obvious way. But it was real, and in a world where the location of a particular ancestor's grave could matter to a family for reasons ranging from the practical to the deeply spiritual, the man who actually knew where everyone was buried had a kind of power that was quiet, unacknowledged, and entirely his own. Word count, 3092. Awaiting, continue. Section 5. You are walking home. It is late afternoon. The light is doing that particular medieval thing where it goes from merely gray to actively hostile in the span of about 20 minutes, and you have spent the better part of the day in a hole in the ground. Your clothes smell of earth and something beneath earth, a deeper, darker smell that no amount of airing seems to entirely remove. Your hands are their usual state of chapped ruin. Your back is making structural complaints that you have learned to interpret as background noise rather than alarming signals, because if you treated them as alarming signals you would never get out of bed. You are walking through the village toward whatever it is that passes for home, and you are watching because you cannot help but notice, after years of practice, the way people's eyes slide off you. Not rudely, not with overt hostility in most cases. Just a gentle, practiced social deflection, the same way eyes slide off a puddle or a broken fence post. You are there. You are noted. You are not quite looked at. This is the social world of the medieval grave digger, and it is where we are spending this section. Not in the hole, not in the churchyard, but in the texture of ordinary daily life. Where you lived, what you ate, who you drank with, whether anyone would marry you, and what the community of people who did this work actually looked like from the inside. Because there was an inside, improbable as it might seem from the outside view. Marginalized people in any society do not simply cease to have social lives. They build them in the margins, and sometimes what they build there is more interesting than what exists in the center. Let us start with housing, because where you lived was one of the more immediate expressions of your social position. The gravedigger, in many parish arrangements, was provided with accommodation as part of his employment terms. A small dwelling adjacent to or within the churchyard itself, a cottage near the church gate, or in some cases a room within a church outbuilding. This had obvious practical advantages for the church. Having the person responsible for the churchyard living on site meant better oversight of the sacred space, quicker response when a burial was needed at short notice, and a degree of security against the various forms of unauthorized activity that medieval churchyards attracted after dark. We will talk more about those after-dark activities in a later section, but for now simply note that the church had good reasons to want someone living close by. For you, the accommodation was a mixed blessing. On the positive side, it was housing, a genuine and not trivial benefit in a world where adequate shelter was not guaranteed to people at the bottom of the economic order. On the negative side, it located you permanently within the geography of death, visible to every parishioner who passed the church, identified by your address as thoroughly as by your occupation. You could not come home without passing through or near the churchyard. You could not step outside your door without being in the space most associated with your work. The boundary between your professional life and whatever personal life you were trying to maintain was essentially zero. The question of marriage is one that the historical record touches on only obliquely, but obliquely enough to give us some useful data points. Medieval marriage was primarily an economic and social institution. Romantic love existed, was celebrated in literature, and presumably influenced individual choices, but the structural basis of marriage was the joining of households, resources, and social positions in ways that made practical sense to both families involved. A grave digger, assessed through this lens, was not an obviously attractive marital prospect. The income was modest and irregular. The social status was low. The association with death and ritual impurity made some families genuinely reluctant to connect themselves to the profession through marriage. And the accommodation situation, as described above, meant that marrying a gravedigger often meant living in the churchyard's shadow, which was not where most medieval families aspired to position themselves. And yet gravediggers did marry. The records, wills, parish registers in the later medieval period, occasional legal documents, show men in this occupation with wives, with children, with the ordinary domestic arrangements of medieval working life. The women who married gravediggers were, not surprisingly, typically from the same social stratum, daughters of other marginalized tradespeople, widows for whom remarriage options were limited, women whose own social circumstances made the gravedigger a reasonable rather than a desperate choice. In some cases, the marriage appears to have been a genuine occupational partnership, the wife involved in the preparation of bodies for burial, in the maintenance of the churchyard, in the economic management of whatever supplementary income the household needed to survive. The division of labor in a gravedigger's household was not necessarily the same as in a more conventionally positioned family. And there is something quietly interesting about the possibility of households where both partners were deeply engaged with the practical business of death in ways that most of their neighbors were not. Children born to grave diggers occupied an interesting social position. On one hand, they inherited their father's stigma, associated from birth with the occupation and the social status it carried. On the other hand, they also sometimes inherited the work itself, the understood right to dig in a particular churchyard, the accumulated knowledge of that specific piece of ground, the relationships with the parish clergy that made the work possible. A grave digger's son who followed his father into the trade was not starting from scratch. He had the churchyard knowledge, the tools if they were still serviceable, and the community familiarity with his family's role. This was not nothing. In a world where most professional knowledge was transmitted within families rather than through formal institutions, inherited occupational expertise was a real form of capital, even when the occupation in question was digging graves. The social life that existed within this marginalized community was inevitably centered on the spaces that were available to it. The tavern was the primary one. Medieval taverns, the alehouses and inns that existed in virtually every settlement of any size, were, unlike almost every other social institution of the period, relatively non-hierarchical in their clientele. You went there if you had coin, and the person sitting next to you might be a craftsman, a laborer, a minor merchant, or a grave digger, and the tavern's social logic did not require these categories to observe the same rigid distinctions that operated in the street or the church. The ale was the great leveler, at least for the duration of the evening, and the grave digger who was invisible in daylight became, in the amber warmth of a tavern, a person with stories, and the stories were good. This is one of those aspects of the grave digger's social position that tends to get overlooked in historical accounts focused on the misery and marginalization. The people who worked most closely with death, who had the most direct and intimate experience of it, were also the people with the most remarkable things to say about what they had seen and found and encountered. Medieval people were deeply, passionately interested in death, in what it looked like, in what happened to the body, in the stories that attached themselves to specific graves and specific people. A grave digger in a tavern willing to talk had an audience. He knew things. He had seen things. In a world without forensic television programs or true crime podcasts, the grave digger's first-hand knowledge of the physical reality of death was genuinely compelling, and the social marginalization that operated in daylight could soften considerably in a space where that knowledge translated into something closer to a kind of dark celebrity. There is a mainstream historical observation worth making here about the role of the tavern in medieval social life more broadly. It was, for people without access to the formal social institutions of guilds, confraternities, and parish organizations, the primary space for the kind of horizontal community building that humans require. Grave diggers, who were typically excluded from the guild system, grave digging was not organized as a guild trade in the way that carpentry or weaving was, which meant no mutual aid, no collective bargaining, no institutional support in times of illness or hardship, were therefore particularly dependent on the informal social networks of the tavern and the neighborhood for whatever communal support they could access. The guild exclusion is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it had significant practical consequences beyond the social. Medieval guilds were not merely professional associations, they were welfare systems, legal entities, and political organizations rolled into one. Guild membership meant access to support during illness, to assistance for widows and orphans, to collective representation in disputes with employers or civic authorities. It meant standards of work quality, of payment, of professional conduct that were enforced by the community of practitioners and that gave the individual member a degree of institutional protection. The grave digger had none of this. His disputes with parish clergy over payment had no institutional framework for resolution. His illness meant simply not working, with no support system to catch him. His widow, if he died, was on her own in ways that the widow of a guild craftsman was not. Some grave diggers did find a degree of collective identity and mutual support through religious confraternities, lay religious organizations that existed in most medieval towns and that were open to membership regardless of trade or occupation, provided one could pay the modest membership fees. These organizations provided masses for deceased members, support for the sick, and a degree of community that partially compensated for guild exclusion. The fact that grave diggers sometimes appear in confraternity membership records is quietly poignant. Here were men whose occupation placed them at the furthest margin of the community's engagement with death, joining organizations whose primary function was the communal management of death and its spiritual aftermath. It is either deeply ironic or entirely logical, depending on how you look at it. The food situation in a grave digger's household was what you would expect given the income. Adequate in good times, precarious in bad ones, nutritionally limited in ways that compounded the health risks of the work. Bread was the staple, dense, dark, made from whatever grain was cheapest, supplemented by whatever vegetables could be grown in a kitchen garden, occasional dried legumes, and meat infrequently and in small quantities. The protein picture was not good, and protein deficiency compounded the physical demands of the work in a fairly direct and brutal way. A body doing heavy labor on inadequate nutrition ages faster, recovers more slowly from injury, and has less immune capacity to resist the pathogens it is regularly encountering. The economics of the gravedigger's diet were not separate from the health risks of the gravedigger's work. They were part of the same interlocking system of disadvantage. There is a wonderfully quirky historical footnote here that appears in some accounts of medieval burial customs in England and France, the tradition of the burial feast, or lyke-wake, a gathering of community members at the home of the deceased, involving food and drink, held in the period between death and burial. The gravedigger was sometimes included in these gatherings, which put him in the unusual social position of eating and drinking with the community in the domestic space of the bereaved family, a degree of social inclusion that was not available to him in other contexts. The lyke-wake was a liminal event, a threshold moment, and it seemed to temporarily dissolve some of the usual social boundaries. Whether this inclusion was comfortable or awkward for all parties involved is something the historical record does not tell us, but the image of the gravedigger sitting at the edge of a funeral feast, eating bread and drinking ale in a house full of mourners while the body he would bury the next morning lay in the next room, is one of those historical snapshots that contains a whole world of complicated feeling in a single frame. The clothes you wore were the clothes of the laboring poor, which is to say they were functional, worn, and permanently marked by your work. Earth stained everything. The particular smell of churchyard soil, that deep, organic, unmistakable smell we spent time with in the last section, embedded itself in fabric in a way that made your professional identity legible at a distance. Some accounts suggest that gravediggers kept separate working clothes specifically for the digging and changed before entering social spaces, which is the medieval equivalent of leaving your work boots at the door, a practical response to the reality that your work followed you home in a very olfactory sense. Whether this was consistently possible given the limited wardrobes of people at this economic level is another question. Owning two sets of clothes was itself a form of modest prosperity that not everyone in this position could reliably claim. Historians still argue whether the social marginalization of gravediggers was more severe in urban environments, where social stratification was more rigid and public visibility higher, or in rural ones where community size made total social exclusion less sustainable. The rural gravedigger in a small parish might be, paradoxically, more integrated into community life simply because in a settlement of 100 people, the luxury of consistently ignoring someone was not really available. Everyone's labor was too visible, too necessary, too embedded in the daily functioning of the community to be comfortably erased. The urban gravedigger in a town large enough to support genuine social stratification might find himself more thoroughly invisible. Easier to overlook, easier to categorize and dismiss, easier to forget about until you needed him. What you had, in either case, was a life that existed at an angle to the community it served. Not outside it, you were too essential for that. Not inside it, the social machinery was too consistent in its exclusions for that to be quite true either. Somewhere in between, in the particular social geography of the necessary and the unwanted, you built what life you could, drank your ale, told your stories, went home through the churchyard in the failing light, and got up the next day to do it again. Word count, 3,089. Awaiting, continue. Section 6. The first sign that something is wrong arrives not as a dramatic announcement but as a quiet accumulation of wrongness. A merchant who does not open his stall on a Tuesday morning, a dog barking at a closed door for too long, a smell from a particular house that is different from the usual smells of a medieval street and that makes the people who pass it walk a little faster without quite acknowledging why. You notice these things. You notice them partly because you are someone whose professional life has trained you to read the landscape of death before it becomes official, to recognize its early signatures in the way that a sailor reads weather in cloud formations before the storm arrives. And in the autumn of 1347, or perhaps the spring of 1348, depending on where exactly in Europe you are standing, what you are reading in the landscape around you is something that has no precedent in your experience or in the experience of anyone living. The Black Death has arrived, and your life, which was already genuinely terrible in the specific and detailed ways we have been exploring, is about to become something for which the word terrible is hilariously inadequate. Let us establish the scale of what is happening, because scale is the thing that the mind resists most stubbornly when confronted with the Black Death, and resisting it means not quite understanding what the next several years of your life as a gravedigger are going to look like. The plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted primarily through the bites of infected fleas carried by rats, though also transmissible through respiratory droplets in its pneumonic form, arrived in Europe via trading ships from the Black Sea region and spread through the continent with a speed and comprehensiveness that had no historical parallel. Conservative modern estimates suggest that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's total population died between 1347 and 1351. Some regions lost significantly more. Certain areas of Italy, France, and England lost upward of 60% of their population in the initial outbreak. The total death toll across Europe and the Mediterranean world is estimated in the range of 25 to 50 million people, in a total population that numbered perhaps 80 million before the plague arrived. These numbers are so large that they become abstract, which is exactly the wrong way to hold them. So let us make them concrete in the way that is most relevant to your specific experience. In a town of 2,000 people, which was a reasonably significant settlement by medieval standards, somewhere between 600 and 1,000 people were going to die in the space of months. In a larger city, Paris, London, Florence, the absolute numbers were catastrophic. Florence, which had been one of the most prosperous and populous cities in Europe with a pre-plague population somewhere around 90,000, lost perhaps half its people in 1348 alone. Giovanni Boccaccio, who was in Florence during the outbreak and whose Decameron opens with one of the most vivid eyewitness accounts of the plague we possess, described the city's burial situation with a specificity that is both historically invaluable and genuinely harrowing. You are not in Florence. You are in your small English or French or German town, and the plague has arrived, and the first thing that changes is the pace. The ordinary rhythm of your work, one burial, perhaps two in a bad week, the measured cadence of individual deaths in a functioning community, simply ceases to exist. In its place is something that does not have a rhythm at all. It has a pressure, a constant, unrelenting, accelerating pressure of bodies that need to be in the ground, families that are grieving and terrified and in some cases dying themselves before the burial of their previous dead has been arranged, a parish priest who may himself be sick, and a churchyard that is filling at a rate that its physical dimensions cannot accommodate. The first response in most communities was to dig faster and deeper, to try to maintain the existing structures of individual burial while simply accelerating the pace. You dug more graves. You dug them longer hours. You dug them with less rest between. This phase did not last long because the arithmetic was impossible. The ground could not receive individuals at the rate individuals were dying. The labor required for individual graves, a ton of earth per body, remember, moved by hand with iron tools, could not be sustained at the volume the plague demanded. Something had to give, and what gave was the entire system of individual Christian burial that had been the organizing framework of your professional life. The mass grave, what contemporaries called the plague pit, though the terminology varied by region and language, was not an invention of the Black Death. Mass burial in emergency conditions was known from earlier epidemic events, from battlefield casualties, from famine-related mortality crises. But the Black Death deployed it at a scale and in a social context that made it feel like something categorically new. These were not battlefield dead or anonymous strangers. These were your neighbors, your parishioners, people whose individual burial plots had been allocated and whose funeral masses had been planned and whose families had expected the full apparatus of Christian burial for their dead. Instead, they were going into pits. The logistics of plague pit digging were substantially different from anything in your prior experience, and the differences were all in the direction of worse. These were not 6-foot individual graves. They were large, open excavations, their dimensions determined by the volume of bodies expected rather than by any standardized measurement. Archaeological excavations have confirmed Black Death burial sites, and there have been several significant ones in recent decades, including important finds in London, in France, and in various parts of Central Europe, reveal pits of varying dimensions, some containing dozens of bodies, some containing hundreds, all showing the characteristic rapid, high-volume interment that marks emergency burial as distinct from normal funerary practice. The bodies are often layered, sometimes oriented with less consistency than the strict east-west alignment of normal Christian burial, sometimes showing evidence of hasty rather than careful placement. You were digging these pits, which means you were doing something that was simultaneously vastly more physically demanding than your ordinary work and vastly more emotionally and spiritually disorienting. The volume of earth to be moved for a single large pit was enormous. We are talking about excavations that might be 10, 15, 20 feet across and 6 to 8 feet deep, moving not a ton of earth but potentially 10 or 15 tons, in conditions where the demand for the pit was immediate and the labor supply was shrinking because the laborers were also dying. The workforce available for plague pit digging in a severely affected community was limited by the same mortality that created the demand for the pits in the first place, which produced a grimly self-defeating dynamic that some chronicles of the period captured with remarkable clarity. There were not enough living people to bury the dead, and the effort of burying the dead was killing some of the living people doing it. Your exposure risk during plague pit digging was dramatically elevated compared to your ordinary work, and it was elevated in multiple directions simultaneously. The bodies going into the pit were plague dead, people who had died of an active infectious disease, whose bodies in the pneumonic form of the plague were still potentially transmissible through respiratory contact, and whose fleas were still alive and still infected and still looking for a new host in the immediate aftermath of the host's death. The flea-to-human transmission route meant that handling plague bodies was genuinely dangerous in a way that handling ordinary burial shrouds was not. You did not know this, of course. You did not know about fleas as vectors, did not know about Yersinia pestis, did not have any accurate model of how the disease moved from person to person. What you knew was that people who worked closely with the plague dead tended to get sick, which was accurate, and that the various protective measures your community developed, masks of herbs and aromatic substances held over the nose and mouth, the burning of juniper and other aromatics in the streets, the avoidance of direct skin contact with bodies, were partially helpful and partially not, in ways you could not distinguish because you lacked the theoretical framework to evaluate them. Historians still argue about the mortality rate among those whose work brought them into the closest contact with plague victims: the grave diggers, the body carriers, the women who prepared bodies for burial versus the general population. The documentary evidence is fragmentary, and the specific occupational mortality of grave diggers is difficult to separate from the general catastrophic mortality of plague-affected communities. What is clear is that the people doing this work were at elevated risk, and that communities struggling with plague mortality were also struggling with the loss of the workers responsible for managing that mortality, which created cascading practical crises that contemporary accounts describe with something close to despair. Contemporary accounts are, in fact, one of our richest sources for the experience of this period, and several of them give specific attention to the burial crisis in ways that illuminate your experience. Boccaccio's description of Florence mentions citizens dragging bodies to the churches themselves because there was no one to collect them, and mass pits in the churchyards into which bodies were stacked in layers like goods in a ship's hold. The Flemish chronicler Gilles Le Muissis, writing about the plague in Tournai, describes the city authorities organizing the digging of large trenches in consecrated ground specifically to manage the burial of plague dead, and notes the difficulty of finding workers willing or able to do the digging. An English chronicler describing the plague's impact on his region writes of churchyards being entirely filled and new burial grounds being hastily consecrated to manage the overflow, a detail that has been confirmed archaeologically in several English towns, where emergency plague cemeteries established outside existing churchyard boundaries have been identified and excavated. The hastily consecrated new burial ground is a detail worth pausing on, because it illustrates the extent to which the Black Death did not merely accelerate the existing burial system, but actually broke it and required improvised alternatives. New ground had to be identified, assessed, and formally consecrated by church authorities before it could receive Christian burials. This process normally took time and involved formal ecclesiastical procedures. During the plague, it was compressed into whatever time was available, which was sometimes very little. You were digging in ground that had been consecrated perhaps days earlier, ground whose soil was unfamiliar to you, whose drainage and composition and depth to water table you did not know from experience, in conditions of extreme time pressure with an entirely inadequate workforce. There is a quirky and somewhat astonishing historical footnote to the Black Death burial crisis. In several documented cases across Europe, the usual social restrictions on who could perform burial were simply abandoned out of necessity. Contemporary sources describe women burying their own dead, lay people performing burial without any clerical involvement, members of social classes and religious categories who would normally have been entirely uninvolved with burial labor doing it anyway because there was no one else. In Avignon, which lost an extraordinary proportion of its population including a significant fraction of its clergy, Pope Clement VI, who was residing there at the time, consecrated the Rhone River itself as a burial ground, formally permitting the bodies of plague dead to be thrown into it when the ground burial system had entirely broken down. The idea of a pope consecrating a river as a cemetery is the kind of detail that tells you, more vividly than any general description of mortality rates, exactly how completely the normal structures of medieval life had disintegrated. You were working in this disintegration, which means you were working without most of the structures that had made your already difficult job at least navigable, without the regular payment systems, without the parish organization that normally coordinated burial, without the reliable presence of the clergy who were themselves dying, without adequate tools or assistance or rest. You were working in the presence of a constant, immediate, personal threat to your own life, in a community that was transforming around you with terrifying speed into something unrecognizable, burying people you knew alongside people you did not, in ground that was filling faster than you could manage it, without any realistic prospect of the situation improving in the near term. And here is the thing about human beings in extreme situations that history documents over and over again, and that the Plague Chronicles confirm. They keep working. Not because they are heroic in any dramatic sense, not because they have calculated the odds and determined that continuing is rational, but because the alternative, stopping, withdrawing, abandoning the work, is also a kind of death. A social and moral death that most people find harder to face than the physical risk. You kept digging. In city after city, town after town, the grave diggers kept digging, long past the point where any reasonable assessment of personal safety would have suggested stopping, because the dead needed to be in the ground and someone had to put them there. That someone was you. And when this was finally, eventually over, when the initial wave of the plague had passed and the survivors began the slow, stunned process of rebuilding a world that had lost perhaps half its people, you were still there, still holding the mattock, still standing at the edge of pits that were now, mercifully, beginning to fill more slowly. Changed, certainly, traumatized in ways that your world had no word for. But there. Word count, 3,124. Awaiting, continue. Section 7. The plague has passed its worst phase, at least for now. It will return, as you will discover with a particular kind of dread in the 1360s and again in the 1370s and at irregular, unwelcome intervals for the next 3 centuries. But the immediate apocalypse has subsided enough that something resembling ordinary life is reasserting itself in the streets around you. The churchyard is still fuller than it was before 1347, and will remain so permanently. The landscape of the dead has been physically reshaped by the catastrophe in ways that are visible in the soil for centuries afterward. But the pace has returned to something manageable, and you have time again in the evenings to sit and think and drink your ale and take stock of where you are. Where you are, it turns out, is in a position of somewhat unexpected economic leverage. This is one of the genuinely strange aftereffects of the Black Death that historians of the medieval economy have documented extensively, the dramatic reduction in the labor supply created by mass mortality translated, over the following decades, into improved bargaining power for surviving laborers across essentially every occupation. The Statute of Laborers, passed in England in 1351 in a panicked attempt by the ruling class to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, is itself evidence of the problem it was trying to solve. Wages were rising because labor was scarce, and the people who had survived the plague and still had their skills and their strength were, for the first time in the medieval economic order, in a position to demand more for them. You are one of these people. Your services are, if anything, more needed than before, because the post-plague world has a great deal of burying still to do as the secondary mortality from social disruption, malnutrition, and the plague's returning waves continues. And there are fewer of you to do it. But this section is not primarily about the economics of post-plague labor, interesting as that story is. This section is about something darker and more specific, about the underground economy that grew up around the gravedigger's unique professional position, about the people who wanted things from the dead that went beyond Christian burial, and about the morally murky, legally dangerous, and surprisingly well-organized world of the body trade that connected your churchyard to the emerging institutions of medical education in medieval and early modern Europe. Let us back up to establish the context, because the body trade did not appear from nowhere. It grew from a genuine and significant tension at the heart of medieval and early modern medicine. The tension between the Church's theological position on the sanctity and integrity of the human body and the medical profession's desperate need to actually look inside human bodies in order to understand how they worked. Human dissection, the systematic anatomical examination of cadavers, was the only way to advance the understanding of human anatomy beyond the ancient texts inherited from Galen and other classical authorities. Texts that were often wrong in specific and consequential ways that could only be identified by comparing them to actual human bodies. But human dissection required human bodies, and human bodies in the medieval world belonged, in a very meaningful theological sense, to the people who had inhabited them and to the Church that would resurrect them at the Last Judgment. The official position of the medieval Church on dissection was complicated and evolved over time. A papal bull of 1299, De Testant Veritatis, issued by Pope Boniface VIII, is often cited as a blanket prohibition on the dismemberment of human bodies, though historians have argued extensively about whether this document was intended to prohibit anatomical dissection specifically or was directed at a different practice, the boiling of crusader bones to facilitate transport home for burial. The practical effect, regardless of the document's original intent, was to create an official climate of disapproval around human dissection that made the practice legally and socially fraught for most of the medieval period. And yet dissection happened. The medical schools of Bologna and Padua in Italy, among the earliest and most sophisticated medical education institutions in medieval Europe, were conducting human dissections for teaching purposes from at least the late 13th century, initially with explicit or implicit ecclesiastical permission that was negotiated locally and often involved the bodies of executed criminals, who occupied a category outside the normal protections afforded to Christian burials. The use of executed criminals' bodies for dissection was the official, legally sanctioned pathway to anatomical specimens in most European jurisdictions that permitted dissection at all, and it remained the primary official source of cadavers for medical education well into the early modern period. The problem was volume. The number of executions in any given jurisdiction was finite and unpredictable, and the demand from medical schools and from the independent surgeons and anatomists who were increasingly interested in practical anatomy was neither finite nor predictable. The gap between official supply and actual demand was the space into which the body trade inserted itself, and your churchyard was the primary source of supply. The people who bridged the gap between the freshly buried dead and the medical consumer were called, in later periods, resurrection men or body snatchers, terms that became common in the 18th century when the trade reached its industrial peak, but that describe a practice with roots reaching well back into the medieval period. The earlier medieval version was less organized and more opportunistic than its later incarnation, but the basic logic was identical: someone with access to freshly buried bodies, willing to exhume and sell them, connected to someone with money and a professional need for anatomical specimens, with enough discretion on both sides to avoid the legal and social consequences of an activity that was universally understood to be wrong. You were the person with access. This is the uncomfortable center of this section, and there is no way to talk about the medieval body trade without acknowledging that grave diggers were implicated in it. Not universally, not inevitably, not without significant variation in individual behavior and circumstance, but systematically enough that the connection was recognized by contemporaries and has been documented by historians. The grave digger who knew exactly where bodies were buried, who had keys or access to the churchyard, who understood the schedule of funerals and the depth of particular interments, who could work in a churchyard at night without attracting the suspicion that the same activity would generate in anyone else. This person was the essential logistical link in the body trade chain. The moral complexity here is real and deserves some acknowledgement rather than easy judgment. The grave digger considering whether to participate in the body trade was not making a simple choice between right and wrong in a context where right was comfortable and wrong was profitable. He was making a choice in a context of genuine economic precarity, in a world where his legitimate income was modest and unreliable, where no institutional support existed if he became unable to work, where his family's survival depended entirely on his capacity to generate income, and where the person offering him money for a body that was already in the ground and would never be missed by anyone who checked was offering him something that looked, from inside his specific circumstances, like a solution to a problem that had no other obvious solution. This does not make it right, but it makes it human, which is perhaps more useful for our purposes than a moral verdict. The prices paid for bodies varied by period, region, and the specific needs of the buyer. Earlier in the medieval period, when the medical education market was smaller and less organized, transactions were probably more ad hoc and the prices lower. As medical schools proliferated in the later medieval and early modern periods, Padua, Bologna, Montpellier, and eventually Oxford and Cambridge all developed significant medical faculties. The demand became more consistent and the trade more organized. Surgeons' guilds, which were separate from physicians' guilds in the medieval occupational structure, and which had their own training requirements and their own need for anatomical knowledge, were another source of demand. The independent anatomist pursuing private research was another. The price of a body reflected freshness. Recent interments were more valuable than older ones, both because the anatomical detail was better preserved and because the risk of detection was lower, and the physical condition of the specimen. Here is the genuinely strange historical footnote in this otherwise grim story. There is evidence from some European contexts that the relationship between grave diggers and medical practitioners in the body trade was not always covert or adversarial but was occasionally something closer to a recognized, if officially denied, professional relationship. In some Italian cities, where the medical schools were most developed and the demand for anatomical specimens most consistent, there appear to have been understood arrangements between churchyard workers and medical institutions that operated in a kind of open secret, known to the relevant parties, tolerated by civic authorities who recognized the benefit to medical education, and officially condemned by everyone involved whenever the subject came up in a public context. The hypocrisy was functional rather than accidental. The system worked because everyone agreed to pretend it did not exist. The legal consequences of detection were serious, though unevenly applied in the way that medieval law tended to apply serious consequences. More severely to those with less social protection, more leniently to those with connections and resources. Exhumation of a Christian body was a desecration, a sin, and in most jurisdictions a crime punishable by severe penalties including flogging, imprisonment, and in extreme cases death. The grave digger caught participating in the body trade faced these consequences without the social capital to negotiate them favorably. The surgeon or anatomist who had commissioned the body faced the same official penalties but was considerably better positioned to avoid them, connected to institutions with political influence, able to plead the public benefit of medical education, and in possession of the legal and rhetorical tools necessary to construct a persuasive defense. Unsurprisingly, when the body trade was exposed and prosecuted, it was typically the person at the bottom of the supply chain who bore the heaviest consequences. Historians still argue whether the grave digger's participation in the body trade should be understood primarily as exploitation, with medical practitioners using economically desperate workers to take risks that the practitioners themselves would not take, or as a genuinely mutual arrangement in which both parties understood the risks and accepted them in exchange for their respective benefits. The honest answer is probably that it was both in different proportions in different cases, and that the retrospective assignment of moral categories to complex economic relationships is always somewhat misleading. There was another dimension to the underground economy around medieval graves that is distinct from the medical body trade but equally revealing of the grave digger's complicated position: the trade in grave goods and burial objects. Medieval burial, particularly in the earlier part of the period, sometimes involved interring the deceased with personal possessions: rings, brooches, small objects of daily life, occasionally coins. This practice was more common in the early medieval period and declined as the Church consolidated its position on Christian burial, but it persisted in various forms throughout the medieval centuries, and the objects that went into the ground with the dead were sometimes of genuine material value. The grave digger who encountered them in the course of his legitimate work was in a position to remove them, and some did, in a quiet supplementary economy that operated beneath the official burial record. The Church was aware of this practice and condemned it, and some burial records from the later medieval period show explicit provisions against disturbing the grave goods of the deceased, a prohibition that would only have been necessary if the disturbance was actually happening. The scale of this activity was probably small compared to the organized body trade, but it added another layer to the moral and legal complexity of the grave digger's position, another way in which the intimate access his work required could become a source of income that the official world refused to acknowledge or sanction. What all of this adds up to is a portrait of a person navigating a genuinely impossible set of contradictions, officially necessary but socially despised, legally employed but economically desperate, operating in intimate proximity to resources that others wanted and would pay for, without the institutional protection that might have made honest refusal sustainable. The unholy alliances that formed around the medieval grave and its contents were not aberrations from a normally functioning system. They were the predictable product of a system that demanded certain labor, refused to pay adequately for it, and then expressed outrage when the people performing it found other ways to make the economics work. The body in medieval Europe was both sacred and commercial, depending on who was looking at it and for what purpose. The grave digger stood at the intersection of both ways of seeing, and the discomfort of that intersection was not something he had chosen. It was the position his occupation put him in every day, and he navigated it with whatever combination of conscience and pragmatism his specific circumstances allowed. Word count, 3087. Awaiting, continue. Section 8. The night shift begins not with a clock, you do not have one, but with a quality of darkness. Medieval darkness, genuine pre-electric darkness, is something that modern people living in light-polluted cities have essentially no reference point for. It is not the comfortable dimness of a room with the curtains drawn, or the orange-tinged shadow of a city street after midnight. It is a darkness that has texture and weight and that transforms familiar geography into something navigable only by memory and touch. The churchyard that you know intimately in daylight. Every slope and drainage channel, every established grave and new-turned earth, every crooked stone marker and leaning wooden cross, becomes in genuine darkness a landscape that you move through by accumulated knowledge rather than sight. And that knowledge, precise and embodied as it is, does not entirely prevent the very particular feeling that the darkness of a medieval churchyard at midnight produces in even the most practically minded person. That feeling has a name in the modern psychological vocabulary. It would be called something like hypervigilance, or perhaps a mild dissociative anxiety response triggered by environmental cues associated with death and isolation. In your vocabulary, it has a different name. It is the awareness that the dead are present, that the boundary between their world and yours is thinner here than anywhere else, and that the things your community believes about what happens in churchyards after dark are not merely superstition but accumulated communal wisdom about a space that has been doing strange things to the people who spend time in it for as long as anyone can remember. This section is about that strangeness, about the rich, complex, and genuinely fascinating world of folklore, protective ritual, superstition, and spiritual practice that medieval grave diggers developed in response to the psychological and spiritual demands of their work. It is also about the very real psychological phenomena that underlie those beliefs, and about the ways in which the attempt to survive this job with one's sanity and sense of self intact produced some of the more inventive and peculiar coping strategies in the history of human labor. Let us begin with what the medieval world believed about the dead in their graves, because understanding the belief system is essential to understanding why the grave digger needed protection from it. Medieval Christian theology had a fairly clear official position on what happened after death. The soul departed the body, underwent particular judgment, and proceeded toward either heaven, hell, or, a doctrine that developed more explicitly through the medieval period, purgatory, a state of purification for souls not quite ready for heaven but not condemned to hell. The body remained in the ground until the last judgment, when it would be resurrected and reunited with its soul. This was the official account, and it was genuinely believed by virtually everyone in medieval Christian Europe. But official theology and popular belief are never quite the same thing, and in the case of the dead and their relationship to the living, the gap between them was significant and filled with a dense, layered, regionally varied body of folk belief that the Church never quite managed to suppress or entirely absorb. The dead, in popular medieval belief, were not simply absent. They were somewhere nearby, in a state that was understood differently in different regions and periods, but that consistently involved some degree of continued presence and agency. They could intercede for the living. This was the mainstream theological position as well, enshrined in the cult of the saints. They could also, under certain circumstances, interfere with the living in ways that were less benign. The restless dead, those who had died violently or unshriven, or with unfinished business, or who had been improperly buried, were believed to be capable of returning and causing harm in ways that ranged from the merely unsettling to the genuinely dangerous. The revenant, the returned dead, the corpse that walked, was not a Gothic literary invention of the 18th century. It was a genuine and consistent feature of medieval popular belief, documented in chronicle accounts, in ecclesiastical records of exorcism and reburial, and in the folkloric traditions of virtually every region of medieval Europe. The Norse Draugr, the Slavic Strigoi, various unnamed walking dead in English and French chronicles. These figures appear across the medieval textual record with enough consistency and specific detail to indicate that they reflected genuine communal anxiety rather than mere literary convention. And the responses that communities developed to deal with suspected revenants: exhumation to check the state of the body, staking, decapitation, reburial with specific precautions, were responses that required a grave digger. You were, therefore, not merely the person who put the dead into the ground. You were also, periodically, the person called upon to take them back out when the community decided that a particular dead person was causing problems from their grave. This aspect of the grave digger's work, what we might call the revenant management component, is one that rarely makes it into the general histories but that appears with surprising regularity in the specific, detailed records of medieval communities. Coroners' records in England, ecclesiastical court records across Europe, chronicle accounts of local events. All of these occasionally document cases where a grave was opened not for medical reasons or criminal ones, but because the community was convinced that the person in it was not staying put properly. What the grave digger found when he opened these graves was, in many cases, the entirely natural results of the decomposition process, which, as it happens, produces physical changes in a body that are absolutely understandable as evidence of continued life to someone who does not know what decomposition actually looks like from the inside. Bloating from gas production, skin that has slipped and changed color in ways that can resemble bruising or flushing, blood-like fluids that have shifted and sometimes appear at the mouth or nose, the preservation of some soft tissue in certain soil conditions and certain time frames that can produce a body that looks more intact than expected. All of these are normal, well-documented stages of decomposition that modern forensic pathologists can explain without difficulty. To a medieval grave digger opening a grave in response to a community panic about a revenant, they were evidence, powerful, visceral, visually compelling evidence, that something was wrong with this particular dead person. Historians still argue about the extent to which grave diggers themselves believed in the revenant tradition versus performing a pragmatic professional service for a community that believed in it, maintaining appropriate skepticism while doing what was needed to restore community calm. The honest answer is probably that the line between these positions was not as clear in practice as it is in retrospect, that a man who spent his working life in close proximity to the dead in a world that consistently interpreted that proximity through a supernatural lens could not entirely maintain the detached empiricism that the question seems to require. You were not a modern secular rationalist doing a job. You were a medieval person embedded in a medieval belief system, doing a job that put you in the places where that belief system was most intensely activated. The protective practices that grave diggers developed in response to all of this were a blend of officially sanctioned religious observance and folk magic that the church tolerated with varying degrees of enthusiasm depending on the specific practice and the specific church authority involved. Prayer was the foundation. Specific prayers before beginning a dig, prayers during the work, prayers at its completion. The sign of the cross, repeated frequently. The carrying of blessed objects. A small reliquary, a fragment of a saint's bone if you were well connected enough to have access to such things. More commonly, a blessed medal or a strip of cloth that had been touched to a holy image. Holy water, which the church provided and which had specific protective properties within the official sacramental system, was used by some grave diggers to bless the ground before digging and their tools before using them. Beyond the officially sanctioned religious practices, there was a rich vocabulary of folk protective measures that existed in a theologically gray area, not explicitly condemned, not officially endorsed, operating in the space between religion and magic that medieval culture navigated with considerably more comfort than its official theology suggested it should. Specific herbs were believed to offer protection in churchyard environments, rue again, which we have already encountered in the context of smell management, but also yarrow, vervain, and various other plants whose protective properties were understood in terms that mixed the practical with the supernatural in ways that were not clearly distinguished. Iron, specifically cold iron, meaning unworked iron, was widely believed across medieval European folk traditions to offer protection against supernatural interference, which is one of those folk beliefs that appears independently in enough cultural contexts to suggest that it is responding to something real about human psychology in contact with death-associated environments. The timing of work mattered in the folk calendar of the grave digger. Certain days were considered more propitious for digging than others: feast days of specific saints, particular phases of the moon, the days surrounding the major Christian festivals. Certain times of day were better and worse. Dawn was generally favorable, associated with beginnings and light and the retreat of night. Dusk was liminal and therefore dangerous. Midnight was the most charged and most avoided hour, the time when folk belief located the maximum permeability of the boundary between the living and the dead, and the time when no sensible gravedigger was in the churchyard unless he absolutely had to be. Except, of course, when he absolutely had to be. The body trade activities we discussed in the previous section mostly happened at night, for the obvious practical reason that nighttime concealed them. The revenant exhumations happened when community anxiety demanded them, regardless of the hour. The occasional emergency burial, a death that required immediate interment for public health reasons, particularly during epidemic periods, might fall at any time. The grave digger's theoretical avoidance of the midnight churchyard was one of those professional ideals that practical necessity regularly overrode. And so you developed ways of managing the midnight churchyard psychologically. Some of these were ritual, the prayers and signs and blessed objects already mentioned. Some were practical, carrying a light, whether a candle lantern or a rushlight, not only for the obvious utility of being able to see, but for the psychological comfort of having a point of warmth and illumination in the darkness. Some were social, bringing a companion when possible, someone to talk to and to provide the basic reassurance of another human presence. Some were chemical. The strong drink that dulled anxiety had an obvious role in night work, though it also reduced coordination and judgment in ways that made the practical work more difficult and more dangerous. There is a wonderfully quirky historical detail buried in the folklore literature of several European traditions, the belief, documented in English, German, and Scandinavian sources, that a candle made from the fat of a corpse, called a hand of glory in its most elaborate form, though the corpse fat candle is an older and simpler variant, would produce a light that would not wake the sleeping and would render the bearer invisible or protected from supernatural interference. This belief was held by criminals using graveyards for various nocturnal activities, but also appears in accounts of people whose legitimate work required nighttime presence in churchyards. Whether any actual gravedigger ever made or used such a candle is impossible to verify, and the practical difficulties of acquiring corpse fat through legitimate means were significant. But the fact that the belief existed and was taken seriously enough to be recorded in multiple independent traditions tells you something about the psychological intensity of the nocturnal churchyard as a human environment. The dreams that came with this work were their own category of occupational hazard, and one that the medieval world had a specific theological and folk framework for interpreting. Dreams were understood, in medieval belief, to be potential channels of communication between the living and the dead. A dead person could appear in dreams to convey information, make requests, issue warnings, or simply manifest the incomplete relationship between their world and the living one. For a person who spent their days in intimate contact with the dead, dreams of the dead were essentially guaranteed, and the interpretive frameworks available for making sense of those dreams were frameworks that consistently located them within a supernatural relational context rather than a psychological one. A modern therapist would recognize the dreams of a medieval gravedigger, particularly one who had worked through a plague period or who had been involved in revenant exhumations, as potential symptoms of what we now call post-traumatic stress, intrusive imagery, hypervigilance, disturbances of sleep and rest, the flattening of affect and withdrawal from social connection that comes from sustained exposure to overwhelming stimuli. The medieval grave digger interpreted these same experiences through the framework available to him as evidence of spiritual attack, of the restlessness of specific souls he had buried, of the need for specific prayers or rituals to restore the proper boundary between himself and the dead he served. Whether the medieval framework or the modern one is more useful is a question that depends heavily on what you think frameworks are for. The medieval framework did not explain the mechanism of the distress, but it provided something the modern clinical framework sometimes struggles with: a set of meaningful actions to take in response. You could pray for the soul that was disturbing you. You could ask the priest to say a mass for the restless dead. You could make a specific pilgrimage, perform a specific ritual, observe a specific fast. These actions gave the distress a shape and gave the sufferer something to do about it, which is not nothing, and which may have provided more practical relief than the most accurate diagnosis without a treatment protocol. The night shift ended, as it always did, with the slow return of light. The gray pre-dawn that transformed the churchyard from a landscape of charged darkness back into the familiar cold ground of your working day. You blew out your candle. You said the morning prayer. You went home if home was nearby, or you waited by the church gate if it was not. And then the ordinary day began again, with its ordinary graves and its ordinary requests, and the night receded into the particular category of experience that you learned, over the years, to carry without quite examining it too closely. That skill of carrying things without examining them was perhaps the most essential one the job required, and the one that was never listed in any account of what a grave digger did. Word count, 3098. Awaiting, continue. Section 9. Time moves differently when you are old. Not in the philosophical sense that people mean when they say that, not the subjective acceleration of years that everyone above a certain age recognizes, but in the specific, physical, daily sense of a body that has been doing hard work for decades and that now registers the passage of time in its joints and its spine and its hands with a precision that no clock could match. You are older now. How much older depends on when you started and how fortunate you have been, but if you have made it to what the medieval world would consider genuine old age, somewhere in your late 50s perhaps, or your 60s if the saints have been particularly attentive to your welfare, you are carrying your working life in your body in ways that are impossible to ignore or disguise. Your back does not straighten fully in the morning anymore. Your hands, in cold weather, close reluctantly around tool handles that they once gripped without thought. The shoulders that swung a mattock for 30 years have developed a geography of pain that you have learned to navigate the way you learned to navigate the churchyard in darkness. By memory, by accommodation, by the kind of patient adaptation that sustained suffering eventually teaches. This final section is about endings, not just yours, but the ending of an entire way of doing this work, the slow transformation of the burial trade over the later medieval and early modern periods, the gradual replacement of the individual gravedigger by different institutional arrangements, and the way that the men who spent their lives opening the earth for others were themselves buried by time in a particularly comprehensive way, leaving almost no trace in the historical record beyond the occasional name in a parish account and the silent testimony of the graves they dug, which outlasted them by centuries. But before we get to the endings, let us spend a moment with the later medieval period as a living reality, the world you are inhabiting in this final stretch of your working life, which is a world substantially changed from the one you entered the profession in. The Black Death and its recurring waves have permanently altered the demographic, economic, and social landscape of Europe. The population has not recovered. It will not recover to pre-plague levels until well into the 16th century in most regions. And this sustained demographic depression has had effects that run through every aspect of life in ways both obvious and subtle. Labor is more valuable than it was. The rigid social hierarchies of the high medieval period have been destabilized by the sheer randomness of plague mortality, which killed nobles and peasants, priests and craftsmen, with an impartiality that feudal social theory had no framework for accommodating. The peasant uprisings of the later 14th century, the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the French Jacquerie of 1358, and various smaller upheavals across the continent, were expressions of a social pressure that the plague had created by demonstrating unavoidably and at enormous scale that the people at the bottom of the social order were not naturally, inevitably, cosmically suited to remain there. You are not a peasant exactly, your relationship to the land and to lordship is different from the agricultural serfs, but the general loosening of social rigidity that the post-plague world represents has touched your life too, in modest and specific ways. The wages you can negotiate for burial work are somewhat better than they were before the plague, not because your social status has improved, but because the supply of people willing and able to do the work has decreased and the demand for it has not. You are, in the post-plague world, slightly less replaceable than you were before, and this slight decrease in replaceability has translated into a slight improvement in your material circumstances that your pre-plague self would have noticed and valued. The institutional landscape of burial is also changing around you in the later medieval period, driven by forces that are only partly about the plague and partly about broader developments in the organization of urban life, religious practice, and civic administration. The growth of towns and the increasing sophistication of municipal government in the 14th and 15th centuries meant that burial, like many other aspects of community life that had previously been managed entirely through the church, began to attract the attention of civic authorities who had ideas about regulation, standardization, and the proper management of public health. The connection between burial practices and epidemic disease was understood, even without accurate germ theory, at a practical level that generated regulatory interest. Where bodies were buried, how deep, how quickly after death, under what circumstances mass burial was permitted. All of these questions were increasingly subjects of civic ordinance as well as ecclesiastical rule in the larger towns and cities of the later medieval period. For you, this meant navigating an additional layer of authority beyond the parish priest, civic officials, health boards in some Italian cities where the administrative response to plague had been most sophisticated, guild-like organizations of burial workers in some contexts that began to impose their own standards and requirements. The bureaucratization of death, which is a phrase that sounds almost comically modern but describes a real process that was beginning in the later medieval period, was changing the texture of your work in ways that added paperwork, or its equivalent in a world where you might not be literate, to the already considerable physical demands of the job. The religious landscape was shifting too, in ways that would ultimately have profound effects on the burial trade even if their full implications were not yet visible in your lifetime. The late medieval church was an institution under significant internal and external pressure, from reforming movements within, from growing lay literacy and theological independence, from the long-running tensions between papal authority and secular rulers that had been a feature of medieval politics for centuries. The Black Death had specifically damaged the church's institutional credibility in ways that were difficult to repair. The clergy had died alongside everyone else. The prayers and processions and masses had not stopped the plague. The theological explanations offered for why God had permitted such catastrophe were not entirely satisfying to a population that had watched half its members die. The subtle erosion of unquestioned ecclesiastical authority that characterized the later medieval period would, within 2 centuries, produce the Reformation, and the Reformation would change burial practice in Protestant regions fundamentally, removing the elaborate liturgical apparatus of the Catholic funeral mass, and with it much of the economic and institutional structure within which your trade had operated. But that is slightly beyond your time. What you are living through is the earlier, slower version of this shift, the gradual development of what historians call lay piety, a form of religious engagement that was more personal, more independent, and less entirely mediated by the institutional church than the high medieval norm. The growth of chantry chapels, private endowments that paid for masses to be said for the souls of specific individuals and families, represented one expression of this, and chantry chapels required maintenance, required someone to manage their physical space, often required burial arrangements for their patrons. The growth of private burial arrangements outside the standard parish churchyard system, in monastery churches, in private chapels, in the increasingly elaborate family mausoleums of the wealthy, created new burial contexts with their own labor requirements. The craft of the grave digger was, in the later medieval period, becoming slightly more differentiated, not in the sense of becoming more socially respected, but in the sense of branching into a wider range of specific arrangements and institutional contexts. The sexton model, in which a single church-employed individual managed the full range of burial-related tasks, was becoming more common and more formalized in English parishes. The independent grave digger, called upon as needed and paid per grave, was becoming slightly less common as parish administration became more systematic. Neither of these developments dramatically improved the social or economic position of the people doing the work, but they did change its texture, more regularized, more institutionally embedded, slightly less precarious in its day-to-day uncertainty. The tools of the trade had not changed substantially, which is itself a historical data point worth noting. The mattock and shovel that your grandfather used, if your grandfather was also a grave digger, were essentially the same tools you were using, perhaps slightly better iron, perhaps a handle shaped by the accumulated wisdom of generations of use, but functionally identical. The wheelbarrow, which would eventually transform the logistics of moving excavated earth, was known in the medieval period. It appears in manuscript illustrations from the 13th century onward, but its adoption in specific trades was uneven and whether it had found its way into your particular churchyard practice depended heavily on local circumstances. The basic physical demands of the work were unchanged, which meant that the physical consequences for the people doing it were unchanged, which meant that the pattern of premature physical aging, the joint damage, the respiratory compromise, the accumulated occupational injury, continued in the later medieval period exactly as it had in the earlier one. There is a mainstream historical observation to be made here about the general invisibility of manual laborers in the documentary record of the medieval period, and the specific invisibility of grave diggers within that general category. The historical record is made by the literate, and the literate were predominantly the clergy, the nobility, and the wealthy merchant class. The laboring poor, the people who built the cathedrals, who farmed the land, who made the cloth, who dug the graves, appear in that record primarily when they intersect with the concerns of the record makers, when they pay taxes, when they commit crimes, when they participate in uprisings, when they appear in court. The daily texture of their lives, the quality of their experience, the way they understood themselves and their work and their position in the world, this is largely absent, and what we have instead is inference, archaeological evidence, and the occasional illuminated manuscript image of a man with a shovel that tells us what the tools looked like but nothing about the person holding them. Historians still argue about whether this invisibility was simply a function of who controlled the means of record production, or whether it also reflected something about the self-understanding of people in this social position, a relative absence of the kind of self-narrativizing impulse that produces diaries, letters, and memoirs. The honest answer is probably that both are true and that they reinforced each other. A world that did not think the experiences of grave diggers were worth recording also did not produce grave diggers who thought their experiences were worth trying to record. And this mutual disregard has left us with a historical silence at precisely the point where the most interesting human story was happening. What replaced the medieval grave digger, in the slow unfolding of the early modern period, was not a single successor institution but a gradual redistribution of the work among different people and different organizational forms. The parish sexton persisted and formalized. Funeral trades, the undertaker, the coffin maker, the professional funeral director, slowly differentiated out of the general burial economy over the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, eventually producing the modern funeral industry with its clean professional boundaries and its comfortable institutional distance from the physical reality of death. The body-snatching trade reached its industrial peak in the 18th and early 19th centuries before the Anatomy Act of 1832 in Britain and equivalent legislation in other countries finally addressed the legitimate demand for anatomical specimens through official channels, a resolution that arrived about 5 centuries later than it was needed. The churchyards themselves filled up, overflowed, were built over, were excavated by archaeologists who found in them the layered evidence of everything we have been talking about tonight. The bones that you displaced into charnel houses, the plague pit burials that you dug in conditions of extremity, the carefully east-west oriented shroud burials of ordinary parishioners, the slightly off-center interments of those whose claim to full Christian burial was contested. All of this is in the ground, and the ground remembers it even when the written record does not. Your name, in all likelihood, is not in any surviving document. The parish accounts that might have recorded your payment have not survived, or survive without enough specificity to identify you as an individual rather than a function. The graves you dug have been dug over, built over, forgotten. The churchyard you maintained is perhaps still there, perhaps not. Many medieval parish churches in rural Europe still stand in their original locations, surrounded by ground that has been burial ground for 1,000 years, and the people who walk through those churchyards today are walking on the work of people like you without knowing it, without having any way to know it, without the historical record giving them any tools to know it. That is perhaps the most appropriate ending for a working life spent putting others into the ground, to be put into the ground yourself, as quietly and as completely, leaving nothing behind but the work. The graves themselves, the physical fact of the opened and closed earth, the silent testimony of a job that needed doing and that you did day after day, in the cold and the dark and the smell, without recognition, without adequate compensation, without the social acknowledgement that the necessity of your work should logically have demanded. You did it anyway. That is the whole story, really. The rest is just detail. And now, as we come to the end of tonight's journey, let the story settle gently around you like earth smoothed over after the work is done. The medieval grave digger, that unnamed, unacknowledged, essential figure at the edge of every community, has been with us all this time, and it is right, perhaps, to let him rest now in the quiet he was rarely given in life. The cold is fading from the story. The smell of turned earth is softening into something more like garden soil on a warm morning, the kind that smells of growth rather than ending. The mattock is put down. The churchyard gate is closed. Somewhere in the distance, very faintly, a bell is ringing. Not the slow toll of the funeral knell, but something lighter, more ordinary, the sound of a village going about its living day. Your body is heavy now, in the comfortable way that comes after a long journey well completed. Your breath is slow. The darkness behind your closed eyes is the warm darkness of rest, not the charged darkness of a midnight churchyard, and there is nothing in it that requires your attention or your labor. The dead are in their places, the living are in theirs, and you are here at the edge of sleep, where the story ends and the dreaming begins. Let it carry you gently. You have done enough for one night. Rest now. End of script. Sweet dreams.